because God never gives up on us, we need never give up. Why should we? From the many true and apocryphal stories about the life of Winston Churchill comes the report of a singular commencement, the address at Harrow School, 1941, and after enduring a lengthy introduction, Churchill is reported to have risen from his seat, strode to the podium, and stared fixedly at his audience of new graduates. And he said, "Never, never, never give up." And he then turned, walked back to his chair, and sat down. And as the stunned students momentarily sat in silence, Churchill, with perfect timing, once again, rose from his chair, returned to the podium, and again announced, "Never, never, never give up." Now terrified they might respond improperly, the audience never uttered a squeak as their speaker once again returned to his seat. And sure enough, Churchill returned to the podium again and again and yet again, 5 times, each time delivering that same single-minded message: never, never, never give up. And at last, feeling he had exhausted his audience and driven home his point, he himself did give up and returned to his podium no more. But you can be sure that every graduate in that audience never forgot that speech and never forgot that he or she was to never give up. Has the church forgotten that it has received the same message from the divine? God has promised never to give up on us. All the scriptures, the Old and the New Testaments together, are a record of how God never, never, never gives up. Adam and Eve, they disobeyed the very first rule, but God never gave up. Abraham wandered and Sarah laughed, but God never gave up. Moses hid and shook with fear, but God never gave up. Saul went insane, but God never gave up. David plotted against Uriah, but God never gave up. Ahaz sold out to Assyria, but God never gave up. Israel failed. They fell into pieces, but God never gave up. The Jewish people became exiles, but God never gave up. John the Baptist was beheaded, but God never gave up. See, Peter denied he even knew Jesus, but God never gave up. The disciples all ran away, but God never gave up. You see, when the gardener in our today's gospel text volunteers not to give up on the slow-to-fruit fig tree, he commits himself to a year of shoveling manure. The text doesn't say how one more year has he given to this tree, but we can only imagine. We don't know if the following year the tree bear any fruit or not, but that's not the point. The unwillingness of the gardener to give up is what matters. To never give up doesn't mean the same thing as to never suffer defeat. At the beginning of our reading this morning, people came to Jesus with a really terrible story. They told of people from Galilee who had come to Jerusalem to make their sacrifices. at the temple. And while they were there, Pilate's soldiers had attacked them, killed them, and had mixed the blood of their animal sacrifices. Now, the soldiers carried out these murders in the temple. And they not only hacked these Galileans to death, but they mingled their blood with the blood of the sacrifices that these people had been preparing to make. But imagine a violent murder in the middle of worship. Imagine human blood mixed with communion wine. That is what happened in Jerusalem. It was terrible, and people were horrified. They couldn't get it off their minds, and they wanted an explanation. What did these Galileans do to deserve such fate? Had they committed some terrible sin? Was this God's punishment? But Jesus' answer was short and sweet and said, no. These Galileans were no worse than anyone else. They hadn't done anything terrible. This was not their punishment for some grievous sin. God was not behind these murders. Perhaps the people who had been killed had offended Pilate. Or maybe perhaps they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But they did not offend God. This was not God's doing. Now, these people were not being punished for their sins, but now we get to the point, the whole point of this text. But listen carefully to what follows. But unless you repent, you will all perish in the same way. Unless you repent, you will all perish in the same way. You see, Jesus refused to give those questioning him the easy answer. And the easy answer is to say that only the bad people suffer while the good people are blessed. Go through life unscathed. No, that's not the case. Murder and mayhem may still come even while you are involved in carrying out good deeds or sacrificial duties. Mayhem may still come even when you do the best you can to reach out to the community. You see, Jesus knew the people of Jerusalem were headed in the wrong direction. And he wanted to warn them. He wasn't trying to scare or to condemn them. He was just trying to save them. There was hope, but they had to act. They had to repent. They had to turn around and go in the other direction. Here come again the parable of the fig tree that a landowner planted and left in the care of his gardener. And after 3 years, he checked the tree, found that it was not bearing fruit. And the landowner told the gardener to cut it down. But the gardener didn't want to cut it down. He had worked with that tree for 3 years. And he wasn't ready to give it up. He had watered it, he had fertilized it, and he pruned it. And maybe he even prayed for it. So he said, "Sir, let it alone for 1 more year. Just 1 more year until I dig around again and put manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down." See, but even when you do the things you're determined to do, to dig around and to give fertilizer for yet another year, 1 more year, mayhem may still happen. You may not have any result for your effort. We know that this church had been declining for years. no fruit. Perfect condition for giving up. No, but that doesn't mean we give up on God and give up on the existence of justice and mercy and grace. We are to continue doing what God has given us to do. You know, in the 90s, when I first started in my ministry, a story came out of the Fellowship Center Church in Fort Lauderdale who experienced what it means to never give up. Under the guidance of their lead pastor, Dennis Grant, this church took in and began to nurture a young boy. For by age 12, he had already stacked up 57 arrests. You know, his name was Percy Campbell. The people knew him by his nickname, Crime Boy. See, slowly, as the church and youth leaders worked with Percy, he began to be known, instead of Crime Boy, he was known as Church Boy. The entire congregation celebrated when Church Boy marked 1 year free of crime. But now something has gone awry. Arrested once more, this time for breaking into a shed to steal a bicycle. Church Boy is now being re-christened Backsliding Boy. Now, today, Backsliding Boy is 36-year-old. His life is still a mess. He has been into troubles all through his life. Should Fellowship Center Church give up on Percy? Do we just let backsliders slip through our fingers without even trying to hold on to their hearts, their souls? Are we willing to let them lost souls fall through the cracks because we, the church, give up? No parent searching for a lost child can never give up. Ever read some of those heartbreaking missing children posters hanging in a post office or stapled to neighborhood telephone poles or on websites dedicated to find lost children? If you look carefully, you will be shocked to see that the last seen dates on some of these pictures are even in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Even when over 2 and 3 decades have passed, a parent cannot stop searching. We should not give up. We all have our part to play. We are constantly asking God to solve the world's problems. God is asking us to do the same thing. We need the spirit that Winston Churchill embodied so memorably. Not only his part of not giving up, but as he wrote to President Roosevelt, send us the tools and we will do the job. That ought to be our approach to prayer. Rather than praying for peace in the world, we need to pray that God would make us peacemakers. Rather than asking God for special favors, we need to pray that God shows us someone less fortunate than ourselves who needs our assistance. Is our faith mere superstition, or is it authentic Christian faith? Do you attempt to use God, or are you willing to be used by God? You know, when we allow God to use us instead of us using God, we will be empowered and have a grace-filled and joy-filled life as Christians. And this is what God accomplished when the crucifixion became the way to the resurrection. Judgment and death, the ultimate give up, have been replaced by redemption and everlasting life. The eternal never, never, never give up. Amen.